Old Hoffmann had made his fortune on plantations in South America. There he married a young woman from a distinguished family, and shortly after the wedding returned with her to his homeland in northern Germany. They settled in my town, where the rest of his relatives also lived. It was here that Paolo was born. I knew his parents only superficially. People said Paolo was the spitting image of his mother. I first saw him when our fathers brought us to school. Before me stood a slender boy with dark skin. I can still vividly picture him, black hair falling in long curls onto the collar of his sailor suit, framing a narrow, pensive face. We were both spoiled by the comforts of home and the new environment with its bare walls and, above all, the repulsive man with a red beard who was determined to teach us the alphabet filled us with resistance. When my father turned to leave, I clung to the tails of his coat, sobbing. Paolo, however, remained motionless, leaning against the wall, lips pressed tightly together, his large tear-filled eyes fixed on the carefree schoolchildren who jostled each other and hurled mocking remarks in our direction. Surrounded by unfamiliar and unfriendly faces, we immediately felt a mutual sympathy. When the red-bearded teacher seated us side by side, we were genuinely delighted. From that day on, we were inseparable, growing up together, learning together, and exchanging sandwiches every day. I remember he was already frail back then. He often missed classes, and when he returned, the bluish veins on his temples and cheeks stood out even more clearly, a common trait among those with delicate, dusky skin. Those veins remained with him for life. They were the first thing I noticed when we met again, first in Munich, then in Rome. Our school friendship was built on the same foundation as its beginning, a shared pathos of detachment from the majority. We were the kind who, at 15, read Heine in secret and, by the third grade, passed infallible judgments on the world and its people. At 16, we began taking dance lessons together and together experienced our first love. He fell passionately for a girl blonde, cheerful, like a ray of sunlight. His feeling was intense, tinged with the gentle melancholy typical of youth. At times, it even seemed frightening to me. One party stands out in my memory. The girl gave 2 cotillion ribbons to another boy, and none to Paolo. I watched him anxiously. He stood against the wall, staring at his polished shoes, and suddenly fainted. He was taken home immediately and spent a week in bed. That, I believe, was when it became clear he had a heart condition. He began to draw and revealed genuine talent. I still have a sheet of paper with a charcoal portrait of the girl. At the bottom, he wrote, "You are as tender as a flower, Paolo Hoffmann fecit." I don't recall exactly when it happened, but we were already in the upper grades when his parents moved to Karlsruhe, where old Hoffmann had influential connections. Paolo was left behind and placed in the care of an elderly teacher. That arrangement didn't last long. I'm not certain whether the following incident was the direct cause of his departure, but it certainly played a role. One day, during a religious studies lesson, the pastor strode angrily toward Paolo and pulled from beneath the Old Testament a sheet of paper bearing the unfinished sketch of a half-naked woman. And so Paolo left to join his parents in Karlsruhe. At first, we exchanged postcards, but gradually the correspondence faded. About 5 years passed since our separation when I happened to run into him in Munich. It was a beautiful spring morning, and I was walking down Amalienstrasse when I saw a man descending the steps of the academy. His silhouette reminded me of an Italian model. As I drew closer, I recognized Paolo. Of medium height, slender, with thick black hair and a yellowish complexion laced with bluish veins, he was dressed elegantly, though carelessly. 2 buttons on his vest were left undone. He approached me with his slightly swaying, indifferent gait. We recognized each other almost instantly. The meeting was genuinely warm. We stepped into Café Minerva and immediately began bombarding one another with questions about all we had lived through in the past years. Paolo seemed to be in high spirits, almost euphoric. His eyes sparkled, his movements were impulsive, his gestures animated. Yet despite all this, he looked unwell. It's easy to say so now, but even then it struck me at once, and I told him so directly. "How?" "Everything," he asked again. "Well, you're right," he said. "I've been ill, seriously, especially last year. It's all here." He touched his chest with his left hand. "My heart. It's still the same. But lately I've been feeling well, even excellent. I could almost say I'm perfectly healthy. And really, at 23, anything else would be far too sad." He was in a buoyant mood. He spoke with enthusiasm about his life since we parted. Not long after our separation, he insisted to his parents on becoming a painter. He graduated from the academy about a year ago. He was there again now by coincidence, then spent some time traveling, lived briefly in Paris, and had now been settled in Munich for about 5 months. Maybe for a long time, maybe even for good. "Really?" I exclaimed. "Yes. Why not? I like this city, I like it very much. Its atmosphere, its people. And besides, which is no small thing, the social standing of an artist, even an unknown one, is higher here than anywhere else." "You've found a good circle of acquaintances?" "Yes. Small, but very pleasant. I'll mention just one family. I met them during the carnival. The carnival here is pure splendor. Their name is Stein. Baron Stein, in fact. Aristocracy? Financial aristocracy. The Baron was a major stockbroker, played a prominent role in Vienna, moved in titled circles and so on. Then his fortunes declined sharply, and he withdrew from business, reportedly with about $1 million. Now he lives here not lavishly, but quite comfortably. Is he Jewish? He himself, apparently not. But his wife, I believe, is. In any case, they're extremely decent and charming people. Do they have children? No. Well, one daughter. 19 years old. The parents, I repeat, are truly delightful." He hesitated slightly, then added, "I'd like to introduce you to them. It would give me great pleasure. Would you like that?" "Of course. I'd be very grateful. If only for the chance to meet the 19-year-old daughter." He gave me a sidelong glance and said, "Excellent. Let's not put it off. If you're free, I'll come by tomorrow at 1 or 1:30. They live at 25 Theresienstrasse, first floor. I'm glad for the chance to present them my old school friend." So, it's settled. And indeed, the next day we rang the bell of an elegant house on Theresienstrasse. On the plaque beside the doorbell, in bold black letters, was written, Baron von Stein. Paolo had been excited and even exuberantly cheerful on the way. But now, as we waited for the door to open, I noticed a sudden change in him. He became extraordinarily calm, seized by a kind of tense, almost forced composure. His head leaned slightly forward, the skin on his forehead stretched tight. He resembled a creature that has pricked up its ears and tensed every muscle in alert anticipation. The footman who had taken our cards returned a minute later and asked us to wait. The baroness would be out shortly. He opened the door to a spacious room furnished in dark wood. As we entered, a young woman appeared from a niche facing the street, dressed in a light spring outfit. She paused, looking at us with mild surprise. The 19-year-old daughter, I thought, and instinctively glanced at Paolo. Baroness Ada, he whispered in my ear. She was extraordinarily graceful, yet appeared far too mature for her age. Her movements, soft, slightly languid, refined, did not at all match the image of a young girl. Her hair, sleekly brushed back at the temples and falling in two curls over her forehead, was a deep, lustrous black, forming a stark contrast with the matte whiteness of her skin. Her face, with full, moist lips, a prominent nose, and almond-shaped dark eyes beneath thick black brows, left no doubt at least partial Semitic heritage, and yet it radiated a rare, almost hypnotic beauty. "Ah, guests," she exclaimed, taking a few steps forward. Her voice was muted, almost hushed. She ran a hand across her forehead, as if trying to see us more clearly, and leaned against the piano standing by the wall. "And very welcome guests," she added, as if only now recognizing Paolo. Then her gaze turned to me, inquiring, with a faint trace of curiosity. Paolo approached her and, with the slow elegance of someone savoring a rare pleasure, bent toward her outstretched hand. "Baroness," he said, "allow me to introduce my friend, a schoolmate from the days when we were first learning our letters." She extended her hand to me as well, a soft, plump hand, unadorned. "Very pleased," she said, fixing me with a mysterious gaze in which something elusive shimmered. "My parents will be delighted too. You did let them know you were coming, didn't you?" She settled onto the couch, and we took seats opposite her. Her white, rounded hands rested on her lap. The wide sleeves of her dress reached only to her elbows, and I noticed the gentle curve of her wrist joint. A few minutes later, the door to the adjoining room opened, and her parents entered. The Baron, an elegant, stout gentleman with a bald head and a silver goatee, had a distinctive way of flicking a heavy gold bracelet back into his cuff. From his appearance, it was hard to tell whether he had sacrificed part of his surname for the sake of the title. His wife, by contrast, was a plainly unattractive little Jewish woman in a tasteless grey dress, with enormous diamonds glittering in her ears. I was introduced and received with courtesy. My friend, as a long-standing acquaintance of the family, was greeted with a handshake. After a few obligatory questions, where I was from, what I did, the Baron began speaking about the exhibition where Paolo had shown a painting of a nude woman. "An astonishingly delicate piece," he remarked. "I stood before it for half an hour the other day. The tone of the skin against the red carpet is simply striking." Yes, Mr. Hoffmann." He patted Paolo's shoulder indulgently. "But don't overwork yourself, my young friend. For heaven's sake, take care of your health. That's especially important for you. How are you feeling these days?" While I was giving the parents a brief account of myself, Paolo exchanged a few words with the young baroness seated beside him. The same tense composure I had noticed at the door still clung to him. He reminded me of a panther poised for a sudden leap. His dark eyes, set in a narrow, dusky face, burned with a feverish glow, and I shivered involuntarily when he replied calmly to the Baron. "Oh, splendid. Thank you. I'm perfectly well." After about 15 minutes, we rose to take our leave. The Baroness reminded Paolo that the day after tomorrow was Thursday, and he mustn't forget her 5 o'clock tea. Then she invited me to join as well. Outside, Paolo lit a cigarette. "Well," he asked, "what do you think?" "They're very pleasant people," I replied quickly. "And the 19-year-old Baroness? I find her quite impressive." "Impressive?" He chuckled briefly and turned his head. "You laugh," I said, "but upstairs I thought I saw something in your eyes, some hidden passion. Perhaps I'm mistaken?" He was silent for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "I'd just like to know how you—" All right. What matters now is only one thing, Baroness Ada." He fell silent again, lowered his eyes, and said quietly, "I'm convinced I'll be happy." I took my leave, shook his hand, but a faint shadow of doubt lingered in my heart. Several weeks passed. I visited Paolo a few times for 5 o'clock tea in the Baron's salon. It was a small but charming circle, a young actress, a doctor, an officer, the rest I no longer recall. In Paolo's behavior, nothing had changed. Despite his sickly appearance, he remained cheerful and lively, and in the presence of the young baroness, he retained that same unnerving calm I had noticed at our first meeting. One morning, 2 days had passed since I'd last seen Paolo, I happened to run into Baron von Stein on Ludwigstrasse. He was on horseback, stopped, and extended his hand. "Delighted to see you. I hope you'll join us tomorrow afternoon." "If you'll allow me, certainly. Even if my friend Hoffmann, contrary to habit, doesn't come to fetch me." "Hoffmann? What? You don't know he's left?" "I was sure he'd at least informed you." "I had no idea. He left quite suddenly, a bâton rompu. That's what they call an artist's whim. So then, tomorrow afternoon." He tugged the reins and left me in complete bewilderment. I hurried to Paolo's lodgings. Yes, unfortunately, Mr. Hoffmann has left and didn't leave an address. I had no doubt the Baron knew reasons weightier than mere artistic whim. And indeed, some time later, the young Baroness confirmed my suspicions. It happened during a walk through the Isar Valley, organized by the Baron. I was among the invited guests. We set out after lunch, and on the way back, late in the evening, I found myself at the rear of the group alone with Baroness Ada. Since Paolo's disappearance, I had noticed no change in her. She remained as calm as ever and had not once mentioned him, while her parents continued to express regret over his sudden departure. We walked through the Isar Valley, one of the most enchanting places near Munich. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, and we listened in silence to the conversations of the others, as monotonous as the murmur of the water flowing beside us. She suddenly began speaking about Paolo, calmly, casually, as if the subject were something entirely ordinary. "Have you been friends with him for long?" she asked. "Yes, Baroness." "Do you know all his secrets?" "I dare say I know the most intimate truths of his life." "Then I can trust you." "I hope, Baroness, you have no reason to doubt it." "Good," she said, lifting her head with quiet resolve. "He asked for my hand, but my parents refused him. They believe he's seriously ill. But what does that matter, if I love him? I can speak openly with you, can't I?" "I." She paused for a moment, then continued with the same firmness. "I don't know where he is now, but I give you permission to pass on my words, the same ones he's already heard from me. Tell him, if you see him, or write to him as soon as you learn his address, I will never marry anyone but him." "Ah, yes, we shall see." In that final exclamation, alongside her determination and defiance, there was a helpless bitterness so raw that I couldn't help myself. I took her hand and pressed it silently. I wrote immediately to Hoffmann's parents, asking them to tell me where their son was. They replied with an address somewhere in South Tyrol, but my letter was returned with the note, "Addressee unknown." No forwarding address. He had vanished. Hidden himself from everyone, to die alone. Yes, to die. After everything, I came to the sorrowful conviction that I would never see him again. Isn't it clear that this hopelessly ill man loved her with that silent, volcanic, fiercely sensual passion that so resembled the first stirrings of his youthful desire? The selfish instinct of the sick had awakened in him a craving to unite with blooming vitality. And wasn't it inevitable that this unquenchable, burning thirst would consume his final strength? 5 years passed. Not a single sign of life from him, nor any news of his death. Last year I found myself in Italy, in Rome and its surroundings. I spent the hot months in the mountains, and at the end of September moved into the city. One warm evening, I sat with a cup of tea in Café Aragno, flipping through magazines and absent-mindedly watching the lively crowd that filled the brightly lit hall. People came and went, waiters rushed back and forth, and from the open doors came the drawn-out cries of newspaper boys. Suddenly I noticed a man about my age slowly making his way between the tables toward the exit. That walk! He turned his head, raised his eyebrows, and with a joyful well, came straight toward me. "What? You here?" we exclaimed at once. He immediately added, "So we're both still alive." He turned slightly away. Over the years, he hadn't changed much except that his face had grown even narrower, and his eyes had sunk deeper into their sockets. He breathed heavily, unevenly. "How long have you been in Rome?" he asked. "Not long. I spent a few months in the mountains." "And you?" "I've just come back from the sea. You know I've always preferred the sea to the mountains. Since we last saw each other, I've been to many places." He sat down beside me and began recounting his years of wandering. Constant travel, the Tyrolean Alps, Italy, Sicily, Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt. Then I returned briefly to Germany, to Karlsruhe. My parents were eager to see me, but let me go again with great reluctance. I've been back in Italy for several months now. Here in the south, I feel at home. Rome is my favorite city. I still hadn't asked about his health. Finally, seizing the moment, I said, "Judging by everything, you seem much better." He looked at me with mild surprise, then replied, "You think that because I travel so much? Ah, it's just a necessity. What else is left to me? Drinking, smoking, loving all forbidden. I need some kind of anesthesia. Don't you agree?" I said nothing. He added, "Absolutely essential for 5 years now." We had reached the boundary we'd long avoided. Silence revealed our shared helplessness. He leaned back against the velvet chair, looked up at the chandelier, and suddenly said, "First of all, you're not angry I didn't write all this time, are you? You understand?" "Of course. You know what happened in Munich," he continued, almost sharply. "I do. And all these years I've wanted to fulfill a promise. A message for you from a lady." His weary eyes lit up. But he still asked, dryly, "What is it?" "Something new?" "Nothing new. Just confirmation of what you already know." I repeated to him the words the baroness had spoken to me right there, in the noisy cafe, amid the gesturing crowd. He listened, slowly ran his hand across his forehead, and said without the slightest trace of emotion, "Thank you." His tone began to irritate me. "But it's been quite some time," I said. 5 long years, lived by both you and her. Thousands of new impressions, feelings, thoughts, desires." I fell silent. He straightened up and spoke with the very passion I had thought extinguished. I remember those words. At that moment, I saw again on his face and in his entire posture the same expression I had noticed when we first visited the baroness together, that same convulsive, tightly held tension, like a predator poised to leap. I didn't press further, and we returned to speaking of his travels and artistic work over the past years. There hadn't been many works, it seemed, and he spoke of them with indifference. Around midnight, he rose from his seat. "I want to sleep, or rather, to be alone. Tomorrow you'll find me at the Doria Gallery. I'm copying Saraceni there. I've fallen in love with one of his cherubs. Do come by. I'm glad you're here. Good night." He left, slowly, calmly, with a lazy, viscous gait. For a month we wandered together through Rome, this endlessly rich museum of all forms of art, this southern capital, full of noisy, swift, fiery, and inspired life, into which the hot wind still carries the languid torpor of the East. Paolo remained unchanged. Most often he was quiet and serious, at times listlessly weary. But then, suddenly, he would come alive, his eyes would flash, and he would join the conversation with fervor. I must mention one day when he spoke a few words whose meaning I only now fully understand. One Sunday, we took advantage of a glorious August morning and went walking along the Via Appia. After a long stroll down that ancient road, we sat to rest on a hill covered in cypress trees. From there, a magnificent view opened onto sun-drenched Campania, with its grand aqueduct and the Alban hills wrapped in a soft haze. Paolo lay on the gentle grass, his hand supporting his chin, his tired, clouded eyes gazing into the distance. Then, suddenly breaking free from his apathy, he exclaimed, "What air! What air!" I replied with something trivial, and silence returned. But a minute later, without any transition, he asked, staring intently at me, "Tell me, aren't you surprised I'm still alive?" I said nothing. He turned his gaze back to the horizon, thoughtful. "Well, I am," he continued slowly. "I'm surprised all the time. Do you know what my health is really like? A French doctor in Algiers once told me, 'God knows how you're still walking. My advice, go home and get into bed.' He was candid, we played dominoes together every evening. Yet I'm still alive. But I die every day. At night I lie in the dark, always on my right side. My heart pounds like mad, my head spins, sweat breaks out on my forehead, and suddenly I feel as if death is standing beside me. It lasts a minute. I can feel everything inside me shutting down, my heart stops, my breath falters. I leap up, turn on the light, breathe deeply, look around, devour everything with my eyes. Then I drink a sip of water and lie down again, this time on my left side. Eventually, I manage to fall asleep. I sleep deeply and long because I'm always mortally exhausted. You know, if I were to fall seriously ill, I could simply lie down here and die. I've faced death thousands of times over these years. But I haven't died. Something holds me back. I jump up, think of something, cling to words, repeat them to myself hundreds of times, while my eyes greedily absorb light and life. Do you understand? He lay motionless, and it seemed he wasn't expecting an answer. I don't remember what I said in reply, but I'll never forget the impression his words left on me. And then came the day, oh, even now it feels as if it were only yesterday. It was one of the first days of summer, grey, unpleasantly warm, when the damp wind blows in from Africa and the evening sky is streaked with heat lightning. That morning, I stopped by Paolo's to persuade him to go for a walk. In the room stood a large trunk, the wardrobe and chest of drawers were flung wide open. Only his watercolor sketches from the East and a plaster cast of the Vatican Juno remained in place. He stood by the window and, despite my startled exclamation, continued silently gazing out onto the street. Then, quite suddenly, he turned, handed me a letter, and said simply, "Read." I looked at him. On his narrow, dusky, painfully drawn face, with its feverishly gleaming black eyes, was an expression that only death could inspire, a gravity so profound that I instinctively lowered my eyes to the page. I read, "Dear Mr. Hoffmann, thanks to the kindness of your esteemed parents, I was able to obtain your current address, and I hope this letter reaches you. Allow me to assure you that throughout these 5 years, I have remembered you with sincere sympathy. If your sudden departure on that sorrowful day was prompted by resentment toward me and my family, then my regret over it far outweighs the surprise and concern caused by your proposal to my daughter. At the time, I spoke to you candidly, man to man, and at the risk of seeming harsh, explained why I could not consent to the marriage of my daughter to a man whom, I emphasize again, I hold in the highest regard. I also spoke as a father, concerned for the lasting happiness of his only child, and who, had he ever considered such a union possible, would have taken steps to prevent the growth of such feelings. Today, dear Mr. Hoffmann, I write to you again as a father and as a friend. 5 years have passed, and if I lacked the time then to understand how deeply the feeling you inspired had taken root in my daughter's heart, a recent event has opened my eyes. I will not conceal it. My daughter has refused a most worthy suitor, whose proposal I, as her father, could have accepted without hesitation, and she did so solely out of love for you. The years have not diminished her feelings. And if I ask you plainly if your own attachment has not faded, then we, her parents, will no longer stand in the way of her happiness. I await your reply with anticipation, whatever it may be. With deepest respect, your humble servant, Oskar von Stein. I looked up. Paolo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, still gazing out the window. I asked, "You're leaving?" He replied without turning, "By tomorrow morning, my things will be packed." The day passed in a flurry of preparations. I helped him, and in the evening, at my suggestion, we took one last walk through the city. The heat was still oppressive, and the sky was repeatedly slashed by phosphorescent flashes. Paolo was calm, but visibly exhausted. He breathed deeply and often. Exchanging idle, almost indifferent remarks, we wandered for about an hour until we stopped before the Trevi Fountain, the famous sculpture of the sea god's chariot surging through the waves. We stood there for a long time, admiring its grandeur. The lightning illuminated the fountain in vivid blue, lending it an almost magical glow. Paolo said, "Bernini amazes me even in the works of his pupils. I don't understand his critics. If the Last Judgment is more carved than painted, then Bernini's creations are the opposite, painted more than sculpted. Is there a greater decorator? By the way," I said, "do you know the legend tied to this fountain? They say that anyone who drinks from it before leaving Rome is destined to return. Here's my travel cup. I filled it with water. You'll see your Rome again." He took the glass and raised it to his lips. But at that very instant, the sky lit up with a blinding flash of lightning, and the delicate glass shattered with a crisp crack against the edge of the fountain basin. Paolo calmly dabbed the water from his jacket with a handkerchief. "I'm terribly clumsy and, to be honest, a bit nervous," he said. "Let's keep walking. I hope you weren't too attached to that glass." The next morning, the sky had cleared. On the way to the station, a serene summer blue stretched above us, smiling down like a quiet farewell. The parting was brief. Paolo silently shook my hand in response to my wish for his happiness. I watched him for a long time as he stood at the large window of the train carriage. In his eyes was a profound seriousness and something more, triumph. What else is there to say? He died. He died the morning after his wedding night, almost during the night itself. It was bound to happen. Wasn't it the thirst for happiness that had kept him alive all these years? He had to go without struggle, without resistance, at the very moment when his longing for joy had finally been fulfilled. There was nothing left for him to live for. I asked myself whether he had acted wrongly, even cruelly, toward the one he had joined his life with. But I saw her at the funeral, standing at the head of the coffin. And on her face was the same expression I had once seen on his, a solemn, mighty seriousness of victory.